I didn't say a word when my daughter-in-law packed my things into a plastic bin. I didn't cry when my son told me it was the right decision. I just stood in my own kitchen, the kitchen where I had made 30 years of Sunday breakfasts, and I watched them take my house keys off the hook by the door. I was 68 years old and I had just become invisible. My name is not important. What matters is that I had a life, a real one. I taught third grade for 26 years in Dayton, Ohio. I raised my son, Terrence, mostly alone after his father passed. I planted a garden every spring. I paid off my mortgage. I was not a burden. I was not confused. I was not done. But Terrence had decided otherwise, and his wife, Monica, had agreed. And somehow, between the two of them, they had decided that I was no longer capable of managing my own life, even though I had never once asked them to manage it for me. It started small, the way these things always do. Terrence began calling more often, which should have felt like love but felt more like supervision. He started asking questions about my finances. Had I paid the electric bill? Did I remember my doctor's appointment? Had I thought about the future? I told him the future was fine. I told him I was fine. I had a routine. I had my neighbor Betty across the street who checked on me. I had my books and my garden and a life that suited me exactly as it was. Then Monica got involved. Monica was not a cruel woman. Not exactly. She was the kind of person who believed she was always helping, even when nobody had asked her to. She started coming over unannounced. She'd find something wrong every time. A dish left in the sink, a light left on, a grocery list I'd written on the back of an envelope. She'd show these things to Terrence like evidence. In November, they sat me down at my own dining room table and told me they were worried. They'd done research, they said. They'd spoken to a doctor, not my doctor, some specialist they'd found, who had apparently agreed, based on nothing but their description of me, that I might benefit from a supportive living environment. I remember looking at Terrence's face across the table. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I signed a power of attorney 2 weeks later. I am still ashamed of that. They told me it was temporary, just while they helped me get organized. They told me it was standard. They sat across from me at the table of a notary public and smiled reassuring smiles, and I signed because I trusted my son. Do not ever sign a power of attorney for someone who has not earned it. I am telling you this plainly. Learn from what I did. By February, I was living at Brookfield Gardens Senior Living in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and microwaved soup. It was not a terrible place. The staff was mostly kind. There was a TV room, a little courtyard garden, a dining hall where everyone sat in the same chairs every single day. But it was not my home. I had not chosen it, and I had not been asked. Terrence came to see me twice in the first month. Monica came once. She brought a small succulent in a plastic pot and set it on my windowsill like that made everything acceptable. I did not cry in front of them. I have never cried in front of anyone who has hurt me. That is something my own mother taught me, though she taught it by accident. What I did instead was think. I had a lot of time to think at Brookfield Gardens. That is one thing they give you in abundance: time. I thought about my house, which Terrence now had access to. I thought about my savings account, which he could now reach. I thought about the box in the closet of my old bedroom, the one I'd never shown anyone, the one I'd nearly forgotten about myself. In that box, there was a document, not a lottery ticket, something more complicated than that. Let me back up. 22 years ago, before Terrence's father died, the two of us had purchased a small piece of land outside of Lexington, Kentucky. It wasn't much, about 4 acres, hilly, not particularly beautiful. My husband, Raymond, had some idea about retirement, about maybe building something small on it one day. He died before any of that happened, and the land just sat there, paid off in both our names, and then in mine alone after probate. I had not thought about that land in years. It was just there, a thing I owned, a fact about my life. What I did not know What I had no way of knowing when Terrence moved me into Brookfield Gardens was that a large logistics company had spent the previous 18 months quietly buying up property in that exact corridor outside Lexington. They were building a regional distribution hub. They needed land. They had been sending letters to the address of my house, which Terrence now controlled, and he had either not noticed them or had noticed them and said nothing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I found out about the letters the way I found out about most things at Brookfield Gardens, through patience and paying attention and, honestly, through Betty. Betty was 71 and had lived across from my house for 14 years. She was not a gossip, exactly, but she noticed things. She'd seen the certified mail piling up. She'd seen a man in a suit knock on my door twice and leave a business card in the mailbox. She knew I was at Brookfield Gardens because I'd called her from the facility's common phone. They let us use it for 15 minutes at a time, which is one of the small indignities you absorb without comment, and I'd given her the number. When Betty called me back 3 weeks into my stay and told me about the letters and the man in the suit, I wrote down everything she said in the small notebook I kept in my nightstand. Then I sat very still for a long time and thought about what it meant. Here's what I knew. The power of attorney gave Terrence control over my finances and certain decisions, but it did not transfer ownership of my assets. The land was still mine. Any transaction involving it would require my signature. Here's what I suspected. Terrence did not know about the land. He knew about the house, the savings, the car. Raymond and I had kept the Lexington property quiet, never mentioned it much, and after Raymond died, I had simply not brought it up. It was paid off. It generated no income. It appeared on no regular statement. It was easy to forget. Here is what I needed: a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, one that Terrence and Monica did not know about and could not interfere with. That was harder to arrange than you might think when you are living in a facility and your phone calls are limited and your son controls your checking account. I want to tell you about a woman named Harriet. Not because she did anything dramatic, but because she mattered. Harriet was 83 and had been at Brookfield Gardens for 4 years. She was small and slow and her hands shook, but her mind was sharp as anything. She had worked as a paralegal for 30 years. She knew things. I didn't confide in her right away. You learn to be careful. But one afternoon in the courtyard, over watery coffee that had been sitting in the urn since breakfast, I asked her a question that wasn't quite a question. I said, if someone needed to speak to a lawyer without going through family, how would a person arrange that? Harriet looked at me for a moment. Then she said, there's a legal aid clinic at St. Augustine's Church on Wednesdays. They do a shuttle from here for medical appointments. If a person needed to make a stop on the way back, the driver, a young man named Pete, is generally agreeable. She went back to her coffee. She never brought it up again. It took me 3 weeks to get to that clinic. I had to schedule a real appointment first, a routine blood pressure check, so the Wednesday shuttle was legitimate. I brought my notebook. I brought every document I could get my hands on, including a copy of the power of attorney that I'd requested from the facility administrator and kept folded inside a library book in my room. The lawyer I met with at St. Augustine's was a young woman not much older than 30. Her name was Adrian. She was tired-looking in the way that people who care too much about their work always are. She read everything I handed her. She asked precise, calm questions, and when she was done, she looked up at me and said, "You still own this land outright. The POA doesn't cover it unless they can prove you're mentally incompetent, which hasn't been formally established. Do you want to protect it?" I said yes. She said, "Then we should move quickly." What happened over the next 6 weeks I will tell you as plainly as I can, because it was not simple and it was not lucky. It was work. Quiet, careful, unglamorous work. Adrian filed paperwork with the county to formally record my ownership of the Lexington land and attach a notation requiring my personal, in-person consent for any transaction involving it. She also contacted the logistics company on my behalf, under strict confidentiality, to let them know the rightful owner was available to negotiate. The company had been trying to reach me for 7 months. They were not happy about the delay, but they were very interested in the land. The offer they made was $420,000 for the 4 acres. I want you to understand what $420,000 meant to me at that moment. It meant a different life. Not because of the money itself, though that mattered, but because of what it made possible. It made possible the other things Adrian helped me do. Adrian connected me with a geriatric care advocate, a woman who reviewed my case and determined I had been placed in the facility without adequate documentation of incapacity. She filed a complaint on my behalf. She also connected me with a different doctor, one who had actually examined me, who put in writing that I was fully competent. Terrence did not know any of this was happening. I was very careful. When he called, I asked about his day. I asked about the grandchildren. I said I was adjusting. I sounded like someone who had given up. I had not given up. On a Tuesday in late April, I remember it was raining, a slow gray rain that made the courtyard smell like mud and new grass. Adrian called me on a phone she had provided, a simple prepaid one that I kept inside a rolled-up cardigan at the back of my drawer. She said, "Everything is ready. The land sale is authorized. The funds will go to the new account we set up, and I've filed the petition to review the POA." I sat down on the edge of my bed. I looked at the little plastic succulent Monica had brought me, still on the windowsill, slightly dusty. I said, "What happens now?" Adrian said, "Now they find out." The look on Terrence's face when he came to Brookfield Gardens 2 weeks later, and I handed him a letter from my attorney. I won't pretend I didn't feel something in that moment, not triumph exactly, more like the feeling at the end of a very long storm. When the air is still and you step outside and everything is wet and quiet and you know the worst has passed. He sat down. He read the letter. He looked up at me and started to say something about how he had only been trying to help, how he had been worried, how I hadn't understood the situation. I let him finish. Then I said, I understood the situation exactly. The power of attorney was revoked within 30 days following a formal competency evaluation, which I passed without any difficulty because there had never been anything wrong with me. The complaint about my placement was reviewed. It did not result in legal action against Terrence, and I did not pursue that path because I was tired and because he was still my son. But it was documented. That mattered to me. The record existed. I moved back into my house in June. Betty came across the street the morning I arrived home. She didn't say much. She just stood on my porch and hugged me for a long time, and I let her, which is something I don't generally do. I replanted my garden that same weekend. Some of the perennials had come back on their own. The rose bush by the back fence was overgrown but alive. I pruned it back, hard, the way you have to sometimes, cutting away more than feels comfortable so the healthy part can breathe. I want to say something to you. If you're listening to this and you're in a situation that feels hopeless, if your family has decided for you, if you've been made to feel like your age means your judgment doesn't matter, your preferences are inconvenient, your life is something to be managed rather than lived, you still have rights, even when you've signed things you shouldn't have signed, even when you feel completely alone, even when the people who are supposed to love you have stopped seeing you clearly. I am not going to tell you it was easy. I had help that many people don't have. Betty and Harriet and Adrian, and the particular luck of having an asset nobody had noticed. I know that. One of the comments I always think about is the question someone might ask, what about the people who don't have that? What about the ones who have nothing left to leverage? Those people deserve advocates too. There are legal aid clinics, elder law attorneys who work on sliding scale fees, state ombudsman programs for nursing home residents, adult protective services offices. I didn't know any of these resources existed before this happened to me. I know them now, and I will spend whatever time I have left making sure the people around me know them too. What I want you to take from my story is not the money. The money was circumstance. What I want you to take is this. I was 68 years old, and I had been taught, quietly and consistently, to doubt myself. By my son's worried phone calls, by Monica's concerned looks, by a process that presented itself as care and was, at its center, about control. And I stopped doubting myself. I got quiet. I paid attention. I found one person I could trust, and then I did the work. I revised my will the month I got home. I made different choices about who I trusted, in how much and in what ways. I kept the new account. I kept Adrian's number in my phone. And I kept the rosebush. It bloomed the following May, the best it had ever bloomed, honestly. Tall and crowded, and more than I could have expected from something that had been neglected for so long. I am 70 years old now. I do what I want to do. I am not done. If anyone in your family is pressuring you about your home, your finances, your future, pay attention to that feeling in your chest. You know the one. The one that says something is wrong even when everyone around you is smiling. Trust that feeling, and then, quietly, start planning. I've thought a lot about what actually happened to me. Not the legal part, not the paperwork, the human part. How it started, how I let it. The truth is, no one took anything from me all at once. It came in pieces over months, wrapped in language that sounded like concern. A worried phone call here, a look exchanged between my son and his wife there. Small things, easy to dismiss, and I dismissed them because I wanted to believe that the people who loved me were acting out of love. That is not weakness. That is what trust looks like before it gets broken. But here is what I've come to understand. The moment I stopped trusting my own instincts, the moment I sat at that notary's table and signed something I did not fully believe in, I handed over more than legal authority. I handed over my own sense of myself. And that is the thing that took the longest to get back. Not the house, not the money from the land sale. Me. What Terrence and Monica did came from something I recognize now, even if I don't excuse it. They looked at me and saw someone diminishing. They projected their own fear of aging onto me and called it care. That doesn't make it right. It makes it human, and it makes it wrong at the same time, and both of those things can be true. What I did, going quiet, paying attention, finding Harriet, finding Adrian, doing the slow, careful work, that came from something too. It came from 26 years of teaching children how to think through hard problems. It came from raising a son mostly alone and learning that panic never solved anything. A clear head couldn't. It came from my mother, who taught me without meaning to, that you do not show your pain to the person causing it. Adrian told me once, near the end of everything, that most elder financial exploitation cases she saw ended badly not because the law failed, but because the person being exploited gave up too early. They believed the story being told about them. They internalized it. They stopped fighting, not because they lost, but because they decided the fight wasn't worth having. I almost did that. There were nights at Brookfield Gardens when I lay in that narrow bed and thought maybe they were right. Maybe I was too old. Maybe I was more confused than I realized. Maybe the kindest thing was to stop resisting. I'm glad I didn't listen to that voice, because here is what I know now. The actions we take toward others, the small erosions, the gentle manipulations, the decisions made for someone's own good without their consent, those actions have consequences that reach further than we intend. Terrence did not set out to harm me. I believe that. But harm is not only about intention, it is also about effect. And the effect of what he did was that his mother spent 4 months sleeping in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner, quietly rebuilding her own life from scratch. The consequence of my choices, staying calm, thinking clearly, trusting one person, doing the work, was that I came home. I replanted my garden. I revised my will. I kept the rose bush. Those are not small things. Those are everything. If you are older and someone in your family is making you feel like your judgment doesn't count anymore, pay attention to that. Not with fear, with clarity. You have accumulated something over a lifetime that no one can take from you unless you let them, the knowledge of who you are and what you are capable of. That knowledge is worth protecting. Protect it. I am 70 years old and I am not done yet. Neither are you.